Now, in order to understand the gravity of these advisors and how big these big boys of Chinese advisory are, let us turn our attention to figures 14a and 14b. These figures just provide the data to show how big the transactions were that these advisors handled over the period. And what we see for the financial advisors, total deal values were the highest for Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, Citigroup, and at the end of the top 10, they were relatively lower for Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and Rothschild. And the boxes that we see above the bars show the average deal values. So to the extent that you want to go for value rather than volume, we see that some advisors like Rothschild have not done potentially as well as advisors like JP Morgan. Looking at the legal advisors, in turn, we see that the top advisors consist of Linklaters, Clifford Chance, Freshfields, and throughout the presentation and paper, we only refer to the top one or two partners in a law firm so that we don't have to go through this long, crazy list of advisors' names in some cases. And what we see is that also, even among the top 10, there are substantial differences in the total volumes of transactions that these law firms handle. So if Jones Day did the worst in the top 10, then Linklaters certainly did the best. And as we talk about a bit in the paper, and certainly in other videos, the attractiveness of these advisors follows what is known as the power law. So unlike a normal distribution where there's some very good advisors that make a lot of money, maybe one or two, and one or two advisors that make almost no money at all, as you would expect in a normal distribution, in a power law distribution you see one or two advisors doing a fair amount of the advisory work, but then a relatively larger chunk of them doing pretty good, an even larger chunk doing good, and then you got this long tail going out of many advisors just kind of struggling along. And what we see is that there's little relationship between the type of advisor, the type of advisee, and the type of transaction as we discussed. And looking at figure 13, on the figure we show what we label bulge bracket banks and normal banks, and we show big law firms and what we call normal law firms, or those law firms that are not in the top 10, and we show the proportion of advisory relationships that are based in financial centers and not based in financial centers. And just kind of eyeballing the size of these bars, we see that the bulge bracket banks located in IFCs scored the majority of the mandates during this period, but we see that the smaller law firms not based in IFCs scored a relatively large amount of these advisory relationships throughout the period. So of course that leads to the question, well, what's so different about banks in international financial centers that differs substantially from law firms that are not based in these international financial centers?